Peace. What up with you? Give me a second. Got to share this joint to the other outlet. But we're gonna go with chapter 2, bad deal, and I believe I'm gonna have enough time to do time served in Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. All right, I'm back. All right, so this is Bad Deal. Live at Standout Music Productions. Yeah, shout out to Castle. Bad Deal. I almost know my number one goes to trial. Nearly all criminal cases are resolved through plea bargaining, a guilty plea by the defendant in exchange for some form of leniency by the prosecutor. Though it is not widely known, the prosecutor is the most powerful law enforcement official in the criminal justice system. One might think that judges are the most powerful, or even the police, but in reality, the prosecutor holds the cards. It is the prosecutor, far more than any other criminal justice official, who holds the keys to the jailhouse door. After the police arrest someone, the prosecutor is in charge. Few rules constrain the exercise of his or her discretion. The prosecutor is free to dismiss for no reason at all. The prosecutor is also free to file more charges against the defendant than realistically can be proven in court, so long as probable cause arguably exists, a practice known as overcharging. The practice of encouraging defendants to plead guilty to crimes rather than affording them the benefit of a full trial as always carries its risks and downsides. Never before in our history, though, have such an extraordinary number of people felt compelled to plead guilty, even if they are innocent, simply because the punishment for the minor nonviolent offense with which they have been charged so unbelievably severe. When prosecutors offer only 3 years in prison, defendants could receive, if they took their case to trial, will be 5, 10, or 20 years imprisonment. Only extremely courageous or foolish defendants turn down the offer. The pressure to plead guilty to crimes has increased exponentially since the advent of the war on drugs. In 1986, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which established extremely long mandatory minimum prison terms for low-level drug dealing and possession of crack cocaine. The typical mandatory sentence for a first-time drug offense in federal courts is 5 or 10 years. By contrast, in other developed countries around the world, a first-time drug offense would merit no more than 6 months in jail, if jail time is imposed at all. State legislatures were eager to jump on the get tough bandwagon, passing harsh drug laws, as well as 3 strikes laws mandating a life sentence for those convicted of any third offense. These mandatory minimum statutory schemes have transferred an enormous amount of power from judges to prosecutors. Now, simply by charging someone with an offense carrying a mandatory sentence of 10 to 15 years to life, prosecutors are able to force people to plead guilty rather than risk a decade or more in prison. Prosecutors admit that they routinely charge people with crimes for which they technically have probable cause, but which they seriously doubt they could ever win in court. They load up defendants with charges that carry extremely harsh sentences in order to force them to plead guilty to lesser offenses. And here's the kicker: to obtain testimony for a related case. Harsh sentencing laws encourage people to snitch. The number of snitches in drug cases has soared in recent years, partly because the government has tempted people to cooperate with law enforcement by offering cash, putting them on payroll, and promising cuts of seized drug assets, but also because ratting out co-defendants, friends, family, or acquaintances is often the only way to avoid a lengthy mandatory minimum sentence. In fact, guidelines, providing substantial assistance is often the only way defendants can hope to obtain a sentence below the mandatory minimum. The assistance provided by snitches is notoriously unreliable, as studies have documented countless informants who have fabricated stories about drug-related and other criminal activity in exchange for money or leniency in their pending criminal cases. While such conduct is deplorable, it is not difficult to understand who amongst us would not be tempted to lie if it was only the way to avoid a 40-year sentence for a minor drug crime. The pressure to plead bargain and thereby convict yourself in exchange for some kind of leniency is not an accident byproduct of the mandatory sentencing regime. The U.S. Sentencing Commission itself has noted that the value of a mandatory minimum sentence lies not on its imposition, but in its values as a bargaining chip to be given away in return for the resource, saving plea from the defendant to a more leniently sanctioned charge. Describing severe mandatory sentences as a bargaining chip is a major understatement. given its potential for extracting guilty pleas from people who are innocent of any crime. It is impossible to know for certain how many innocent drug defendants convict themselves every year by accepting a plea bargain out of fear of mandatory sentences, or how many are convicted due to lying informants and paid witnesses, but reliable estimates of the number of innocent people currently in prison tend to range from 2 to 5%. I believe is more like 15 to 20%. While those numbers may sound small and probably underestimates, they translate into thousands of innocent people who are locked up, some of whom will die in prison. In fact, if only 1% of America's prisoners are actually innocent of the crimes which they have convicted, that would mean tens of thousands of innocent people are currently languishing behind bars in the United States, and they are. The real point here, however, is not that innocent people are locked up. That has been true since penitentiaries first opened in America, the day they slavery. The critical point is that thousands of people are swept into the criminal justice system every year pursuant to the drug war without much regard for their guilt or innocence. The police are allowed by the courts to conduct fishing expeditions for drugs on streets and freeways based on nothing more than a hunch. Homes may be searched for drugs based on a tip from an unreliable, confidential informant who is trading the information for money or to escape prison time. And once swept inside the system, people are often denied attorneys or meaningful representation and pressured into plea bargains by the threat of unbelievably harsh sentences for minor drug crimes that are higher than many countries impose on convicted murderers. This is the way Roundup works, and it works this way in virtually every major city in the United States. Time served. I want to read time served so bad, but I don't think we're going to have enough time, but I'm going to try anyway. Time served. Once convicted of felony drug charges, one's chances of being released from the system in short order are slim at best. The elimination of judicial discretion through mandatory sentencing laws has forced judges to impose sentences for drug crimes that are often longer than those violent criminals receive. When judges have discretion, they may consider a defendant's background and impose a lighter penalty if the defendant's personal circumstances, extreme poverty or experience of abuse, for example, warranted. This flexibility, which is important in all criminal cases, is especially important in drug cases, as studies have indicated that many drug defendants are using or selling to support an addiction. Referring a defendant to treatment rather than sending him or her to prison may well be the most prudent choice, saving government resources and potentially saving the defendant from a lifetime of addiction. Likewise, imposing a short prison sentence or none at all may increase the chances that the defendant will experience successful reentry. A lengthy prison term may increase the odds that reentry will be extremely difficult, leading to relapse and re-imprisonment. Mandatory drug sentencing laws strip judges of their traditional role of considering all relevant circumstances in an effort to do justice in an individual case. Nevertheless, harsh mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenders have been consistently upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1982, the Supreme Court upheld for 40 years, In 1982, the Supreme Court upheld 40 years of imprisonment for possession in an attempt to sell 9 ounces of marijuana. Several years later, in Harmelin versus Michigan, the court upheld a sentence of life imprisonment for a defendant with no prior convictions who attempted to sell 672 grams, approximately 23 ounces of crack cocaine. The court found the sentences imposed on those cases reasonably proportionate to the offenses committed and not cruel and unusual in violation of the Eighth Amendment. This ruling was remarkable given that the Drug Reform Act of 1986, the longest sentence Congress had ever imposed for possession of any drug in any amount, was 1 year. A life sentence for a first-time drug offense is unheard of in the rest of the developed world. Even for high-end drug crimes, most countries impose sentences that are measured in months rather than years. For example, a conviction for selling a kilogram of heroin yields a mandatory sentence in the United States federal court compared with 6-month prison in England. Remarkably, in the United States, a life sentence is deemed perfectly appropriate for a first-time drug offender. The most famous upholding mandatory minimum sentences is Lockyer and Andrade. In that case, the court rejected the constitutional challenges to sentences of 25 years for a man who stole 3 golf clubs from a pro shop and 50 years without a parole, and 50 years without parole for another man for stealing children's videotapes from a Kmart store. These sentences were imposed pursuant to California's controversial 3 strikes law, which mandates a sentence of 25 years to life for recidivists convicted of a third felony, no matter how minor. Writing for the court's majority, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor acknowledged that the sentences were severe, but concluded they are not grossly disproportionate to the offense and therefore do not violate the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishments. In dissent, Justice David H. Souter reported, if Andrade's sentence for stealing videotapes is not grossly disproportionate, the principle has no meaning. Similarly, counsel for one of the defendants, University of Southern California law professor Erwin Kamarinsky, noted that the court's reasoning makes it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to challenge any recidivist sentencing law. If the sentences aren't cruel and unusual punishment, what would be? Mandatory sentencing laws are frequently justified as necessary to keep violent criminals off the streets, yet those penalties are imposed most often against drug offenders and those who are guilty of nonviolent crimes. In fact, under the 3 strikes regime in California, a repeat offender could be someone who had only a single prior case decades ago, and one arrest can result in multiple strikes. For example, imagine a young man, 18 years old, who was arrested as a part of an undercover operation and charged with 2 counts of dealing cocaine to minors. He had been selling to friends to earn extra money for shoes and basic things his mother couldn't afford. The prosecutors offers him probation if he agrees to plead to both charges and to snitch on a big dealer. Terrified of doing prison time, he takes the deal. Several years later, he finds his punishment will never end. Branded a felon, he is struggling to survive and support his children. One night, he burglarizes a corner store and steals food, toothpaste, Pepsi, and diapers for his baby boy. He is arrested almost immediately a few blocks away. That's it for him. He now has 3 strikes. His burglary can be charged as the 3rd strike because of his 2 prior felony convictions. He is eligible for life imprisonment. His children will be raised without a father. Or imagine a woman struggling with drug addiction, unable to attain treatment, and is desperate for money so he can feed her habit. Together with her boyfriend, she burglarizes 2 homes, stealing televisions they hope to sell. After her arrest, she takes a plea deal, spends several years in prison, and is released with 2 strikes on her record, 1 for each burglary. 2 decades later, she relapses after being clean for 15 years and is arrested for selling crack. She made the sale to support a relapse. That's it for her. She can be locked up for the rest of her life. These examples may sound extreme, but real life can be worse. Sentences for each can change, sentences for each charge can run consecutively, so a defendant can easily face a sentence of 15, 75, or 100 years to life arising from a single case. It is not uncommon for people to receive prison sentences of more than 50 years for minor crimes. In fact, 50 years to life was the actual sentence given to Leandro Andrade for stealing videotapes, a sentence upheld by the Supreme Court. I only got a little bit left, and I'm gonna leave it right there though. So we'll continue with the time served, and we'll get into the prison label next. I hope your today is great and your tomorrow is greater. Peace.